Welcome to Beyond Business, the show where we look at the latest trends in the global economy. Today we're looking at a whopper settlement that sparked heated debate. America's biggest bank, JP Chase, agreed to fork out $13 billion last year. In return, U.S. authorities resolved claims the bank missold mortgage-backed securities before the financial crisis. The story didn't end there, though. The settlement was followed by a lawsuit from a Wall Street watchdog group. They claim the secretive nature of the deal meant that there was no public scrutiny to determine whether it was fair. It's raising questions not only of the JP Chase settlement, but other similar deals. Our Washington correspondent Philip Crowther has more.
This is the lawsuit filed against the U.S. Department of Justice by the non-profit group Better Markets. Its chief executive is Dennis Kelleher. He says the settlement with JP Chase is a secretive backroom deal between the government and the company.
The Attorney General going behind closed doors with one of the most powerful bankers in the United States, from the biggest bank in the United States, and cutting basically a sweetheart deal that cuts the courts out of it. So what they did is they had the biggest settlement in 237-year history of the United States done completely behind closed doors.
The Justice Department tells France 24 it is very confident that the settlement with JP Chase complies with the law. Better Markets, though, believes that the banks on Wall Street are getting off lightly. Because of this, the record $13 billion settlement. JP admits to knowingly selling toxic mortgage-backed securities and thereby contributing to the financial crisis.
A case like this, without any public accountability and without transparency, undermines public confidence and, frankly, is an injustice to the people of this country who have suffered so much from the financial crisis.
Critics say the administration of U.S. President Barack Obama is at fault for not holding Wall Street banks and its decision-makers accountable.
Okay, let's turn now to our guest today, Pierre Salvo. He's a prominent French business lawyer with the firm Skadden Arps here in Paris. He's also passed the bar in New York, so he's well accustomed to the American legal system. It's great to have you here. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
What's the interest of both sides to enter into a settlement like the one between JP Chase and the US government? Why do they want to agree on this kind of a deal?
For the authorities, it's very simple. They don't do the work. They just claim that the company has done something wrong and ask the company if it wants to cooperate. And the company usually wants to cooperate because the alternative is much worse. So the company is going to work with its own money, its own lawyers, its own forensic to look for evidence of wrongdoings. And then the lawyers are going to come back to the authorities saying, here's what we found. And the authorities will say, okay, you're going to pay X, and that's going to be the end of it. So for the authorities, they can multiply the number of cases and the number of companies they go after because they sit and wait for the results to come in. For the companies, the advantage is that this is a way of resolving an issue that could last for years, be in the courts, cost a lot of money too.
You can draw a line underneath very quickly.
You can draw a line underneath. You can write the check and move on. That's what they're looking for.
So basically, for both sides, it's the same argument. They want to get on with business as quickly as possible, basically.
Kind of, yes. And there's more certainty in the outcome, if you will, and more discretion too.
Does it work for taxpayers, though? Is there more certainty for taxpayers as well?
It's a little bit of both. On the one hand, you got more companies being brought in and more companies acknowledging wrongdoings, paying fees or fines, and agreeing to not do it again. So that's good. On the other hand, there is no one that is there to say whether this is fair, whether everything has been disclosed, whether this is the right outcome. That's the role of a judge. And there are no judges in those deals.
So it's justice behind closed doors, I suppose. That's essentially it.
It's really the response of the U.S. authorities to a global world. With a global world and global business, the law, with its own classical boundaries of a state, with courts that have jurisdiction only within that state, that tends to blur away. And so the authorities, the U.S. authorities, found a way to get over that burden and to make deals that are going to reach companies even outside their jurisdiction.
Whenever I see these kind of settlements, I'm always curious to know how the two sides have reached the settlement amount. $13 billion, for instance, in JP Morgan Chase's case. How do the two sides reach the amount that the company involved should be paying? And how can taxpayers be sure that that is the appropriate amount?
In some cases, the way the amount is calculated is pretty straightforward. Number of transactions that were illegal or should not have been taken place, duration, how long did it last, and the attempts for the companies to have hidden it, or contrary, the efforts by the company to disclose them and to cooperate with the authorities. So you have almost charts where you can compute the numbers and get to a final
an
number.
Excel spreadsheet.
An Excel spreadsheet in a way. There's also negotiation between the lawyers who defend the companies and the authorities.
And there's no judicial scrutiny whatsoever.
There is very little. And recently, a U.S. federal judge, Judge Rakoff, who was asked to approve one of these settlements, one of these deals, refused to do it. He said, look, I don't know what we're talking about here. You don't give me the facts. You don't tell me what happened. You just tell me, Your Honor, we have agreed and it's X. Well, I'm not a rubber stamp, so I will not allow it. It was appealed, and finally, the settlement got approved. But you can tell that there is the beginning of a reaction from the judges, the judicial system, to say, hey, wait a minute, where are we in this? Who is going to say whether this is fair and balanced or not?
All right, stay right in your seat, because we're going to look at a different aspect of this story. We're looking at what happens after companies enter these kind of high-profile settlements. How do you make sure that firms change the error of their ways once they've paid up? That's where corporate monitors come in. Take a look.
Corporate monitors are a relatively new breed. The US government solicits them, hence why we find one here on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington.
There's not.
John Hansen, a former FBI fraud investigator, goes into companies suspected of insider trading or money laundering, for example.
Most of the time, monitors come in if there's been a fraud by a person within the company or within management of the company, such that the government is contemplating criminal prosecution.
With a corporate monitorship put in place by a government agency or the Department of Justice, a company can avoid prosecution with a settlement agreement. But with a potential risk, an outsider gets to see the insides of a company.
As a monitor, you have a lot of access to company documents and information. You're interviewing employees. Generally speaking, you have very broad access to records. And even though it may not be within your scope, for example, to go in and look at trade secrets or patent information, you sometimes learn about it anyway.
People like John Hansen are writing the guidelines for corporate monitorships only now, meaning ethically it's up to the monitor to decide how much is revealed to the government.
Okay, we're back in the studio now with a business lawyer, Pierre Salvo. Are corporate monitors effective in your view to make sure that companies abide by the rules once they've entered these settlements?
It's an interesting idea. Have someone who does not belong to the company being permanently in the company for months or years, making sure that it behaves. It's a new idea that the authorities, the US authorities, have put in place. It's a little premature to say to what extent it works, but there's a lot of pressure on these guys to make sure that if something wrong was again performed by the company, they report it. Because if they don't, they lose their job, essentially. Mm-hmm. So they have an intrinsic interest in going after any sort of bad behavior that could occur after the deal has been struck with the authorities.
Is there a risk associated with bringing a corporate monitor in for a firm? I'm talking about if there's a risk involved for a company to bring in a corporate monitor and basically, well, you open yourself up and you give this corporate monitor an awful lot of information.
That's true. I may be a bit naive, but I don't think the risk is very big. The monitor has one mission: make sure that whatever the company has agreed to do, it does. Nothing else. So as the monitor that you interviewed says, it can come across information that is pretty sensitive and confidential. But if it's not relevant to the authorities, I doubt that the monitor is going to take a copy of it and give it to the CIA anyway. I mean, we're getting into a spy novel. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm saying it. I doubt that it happens.
They're
so
likely
much.
to stay on the fence,
Yes.
in your opinion.
Yes.
Now, some people are concerned that even though companies are paying up, they're not paying enough. If we go back to the settlement issue, there are some who say that, you know, even $13 billion for a company like JP Morgan Chase may not be that much. Do you think that the system works, the system with settlements and with corporate monitors? Does the system function?
The system functions very well. That's on the positive side. It is an extremely efficient system. You have a lot more cases that are solved, and companies are put on notice that their turn will come. So that's very efficient. On the other hand, the real issue is there justice in there? And you're absolutely right. If a company has agreed to pay X millions, hundreds of millions, billions, doesn't that mean that, in fact, it was guilty of more than that, if you will? You know, if it has agreed to pay that, then surely it knew that it should have paid more. At least that's the common sentiment that a lot of people have. And when you don't have a judge that comes in and says, I believe that this amount is fair or is not enough or is too much, then how can you tell? And that's the negative side of these deals, if you will, is that the common opinion does not really know.
And another aspect of this is that it's not only American companies that are subjected to the system, also foreign companies too are subjected to the US way of doing things.
Absolutely. Most European banks have been, are, or will be part of those deals of justice, if you will, for one reason or another. The overreach of the US law through the US authorities is quite significant.
So global business, they're just going to have to get used to having the American system encroach itself on other jurisdictions.
Globalization of business, globalization of laws and rules.
All right, Pierre Salvo, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here at France 24. And with that, we're going to wrap up this edition of Beyond Business. Do stay with us.